Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Altmed podcast. Here with me today, as always, is my trusty co-host, Mitch Kurtz. Welcome back, Mitch. And sorry to just skip over that, but I'm a little bit more excited about our guests today. Live from the Cannabis studio, or at least Martin Lane is, we've got Martin and Reese Cohen. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. The Cannabis studio is makes it sound a lot grander than it actually is, but we'll go with Cannabis studio. I like it.
It's Cannabis studio sounds like a hot box.
Yeah.
That's actually not a bad net. We should have called it the hot box.
Oh, that's a great name for a podcast. Anyway, yeah.
Well, getting ready for a bit of a compression session with these guys today. And as always, if you are enjoying the content that we put out, please hit subscribe wherever you are getting this podcast feed. Really appreciate all your support. I'm going to let you kick off, Mitch. I know you've got a few questions for the guys, so fire away.
Well, there's a lot of territory to cover, but I think it's always nice to start with a little bit of introduction on our guests, and maybe we'll take it just based on the way they're sitting on my Zoom platform here. So, Martin, we would love to know a little bit about your background, what brought you to cannabis, and where you're going at the moment.
Yeah, so, well, very briefly, my background is in publishing, not in the cannabis industry, but I started in travel. And then I moved into media and marketing, which were both kind of B2B kind of sort of publishing. And really the last sort of 12 years, most of my time has been spent running a B2B media platform for marketing and media people, which is kind of, half an event business and half a media business, I guess. I finished up in that business about 15 months ago. And the reason I kind of was intrigued by the cannabis industry was for a couple of reasons. One was I was actually invited to go to Advertising Week in New York in 2017. And I was just blown away by how there was a whole stream of cannabis content. There was, the Madden brothers were on stage. There was, celebrity chefs. Obviously the regulatory environment even then was very different in the US.
Yeah.
But that kind of got me quite interested in the industry. And then the other thing was, from a personal point of view, my brother-in-law has got MS and he was prescribed Sativex, which was the first time I'd kind of thought about cannabis from a medicinal point of view. I'd always, it had fairly negative connotations for me for family reasons. So for those two kind of reasons got me interested. And then when I looked at the industry in Australia, it didn't seem that there was a kind of media platform that covered the entire kind of legal cannabis industry. There were obviously people talking about very specific parts of it, but there wasn't anything that, kind of covered the whole ecosystem. So I started cannabis, sort of started working on it early last year, and then we launched in July. Reese joined us shortly afterwards. And yeah, going really well, really enjoying it. Fascinating industry. I think what it reminds me a little bit of the travel industry, in the sense that, generally speaking, this is a group of people who are kind of working together for a common good. So yes, there's competitive tension, and yes, there are things people don't want to discuss, because they're commercially in confidence. But generally speaking, everyone's really kind of been welcoming and wants the industry to thrive, because that's in the best interests of ultimately the end user, the consumer, the patient. So that's quite a welcome kind of breath of fresh air coming from the media and marketing industry, which is a little bit more cutthroat, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, amazing. I thought you were going to say it's similar to the travel industry, because people usually tell you about where they've been and then they wake up off the couch and they haven't actually been anywhere at all.
Yeah, I tell you, the other thing it has the other thing in common very quickly it has with the cannabis with the travel industry is you've got people who from a farmer background, you've got people who are from a general business background, and then you've got other people who are just sort of passionate about cannabis, who kind of came to it through that route. And it's a similar in that sense. You got, a lot of people in the travel industry didn't ever expect to be chief executives of, publicly listed companies. They were tour reps, and, they kind of made their way up through that route. So yeah, there's a couple of similarities.
Yeah, fantastic. And that leads on very well to Reese. A little bit the background for the people who are experiencing you for the first time. Not to say that there'd be too many. It's pretty. It's not like you're shy. So please, a little introduction would be fantastic.
Thanks. First of all, it's crazy to me that cannabis is not even 12 months old, Martin. That blows my mind. But people have been around the cannabis industry for a while. We talk about things in terms of cannabis years, which look like dog years, these things change so quickly. So that kind of makes sense. So yeah, hi. So I'm Reese, and I've been doing stuff in medical cannabis in Australia for about 5 years now. So in a variety of capacities, mostly sort of as a commercial consultant, but also doing other stuff here and there. And yeah, for the last 9 months or so, I guess, I've been the editor at large at Cannabis, and it's been lots of fun. So I have a big mouth and I get paid for it. That's kind of my thing.
That's great. And where did your interest in cannabis kind of spark from?
Very interested in drugs from a young age, like using drugs, and got really interested in the sort of social relationships about drug use and like drug markets and how they work. And basically my initial curiosity was about how you had this system where there were no rules in place, there's no regulations, and yet in Sydney, it's morally unacceptable to charge someone more than X amount for X amount of cannabis. And I was like, well, what's going on with that? So that kind of got me into it initially. And then I had the opportunity to study it at university. So I did my honors thesis on cannabis legalization in Colorado in 2015. And then I was just in the right place at the right time. So medical cannabis got legalized shortly after I finished my uni degree in early 2016. So I've been, doing that kind of work ever since, I guess. Yeah.
And you were involved, Reese, with the Lambert Initiative at Sydney Uni and some of the research that's quite exciting that's coming out of there.
Yeah, that's right. I spent about 1.5 years working for the Lambert Initiative in a kind of project managery kind of role, and have made some good friends there. Have maintained sort of strong relationships with those people and with the organisation. So they've been an occasional client of mine, and they do terrific work. Most recently that driving paper that got published just a couple of days ago. Well, there's 2 driving papers that got one article and one paper that got published sort of within quick succession. Both sort of Lambert affiliated works. That's pretty cool stuff.
It's exciting.
Well, I think
I haven't read that paper yet, but perhaps if I can put you guys on the spot, have you had a chance to peruse it? And I've seen it being talked about a lot on social media channels, but what were some of the sort of the key takeaways that you guys got?
I can field this one, Martin. I mean, it's nothing that you haven't heard before. It's what's interesting about it is it takes a very systematic and objective approach to the current driving laws in Australia and how that relates to legally prescribed medical cannabis. And I think because of the very unemotional, objective, thorough approach of the paper, and because of the kinds of people who are involved in the production of that paper, so the lead author is someone who is employed by the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services in the Office of Medicinal Cannabis, Daniel Perkins. So these aren't uninformed or these aren't external actors. These are people within the bureaucracy who are taking a hard-nosed, objective look at the driving laws and conclude that there's no reason to treat medicinal cannabis differently to any other legally prescribed medicine that we know can impair driving ability. So I think that was the main takeaway from that paper for me.
No, excellent.
Yeah, it's a funny one. Do you know what? I was thinking about this before we came on air, just in the context of Kate Fairman and the story that we ran last week about all the drug tests that were conducted during Mardi Gras last month. I think this is notwithstanding what you've said, that yes, a very sober, kind of intellectual, rigorous kind of research paper is useful. I think this is a really tough one, the whole Drive Change campaign, because of the kind of PR kind of challenge that it has with government and with the wider public. So I think some of the things that, we've talked about this a lot before, about the stories that you can tell, especially around medicinal cannabis. You talk about parents of children with epilepsy, you talk about people who, are using cannabis for their nausea associated with chemotherapy. Those are kind of really powerful stories that resonate with a wider public. I think the problem with driving is people just think, well, you shouldn't drive while you're high, or you shouldn't drive while you're impaired, or you can't drive if you're on certain medication that makes you drowsy. And I hear so many kind of that shorthand of, this is just unacceptable. You can't drink drive. There's all that, and I just wonder whether the government, not, as I say, notwithstanding all of the really good research that's being done, just won't have the kind of political will to do anything about it. And sorry, and just before I stop that little rant, I actually saw earlier this week, there's actually ads at the moment running on TV that the New South Wales government is obviously paying for, warning people about the danger of being stopped for drug driving.
Really?
So they're actually putting real dollars into a real campaign on the telly right now.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, as I say, I don't want to be Mr. Doom and Gloom, but I just think that's a real tough argument.
Yeah.
Well, it's not a tough argument to win, but it's tough to get any change.
Sure.
You might win the argument, but not get any change.
It's interesting. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of with you on that. Like, it's not an easy argument to win necessarily, which is why it's necessary to keep doing it. I think the Drive Change campaign is great in that its messaging is all about equal rights for medicinal cannabis patients and about drawing that equivalence between other prescribed medicines and cannabis medicines. I think that's the best way to address those objections. New South Wales is going to be one of the last states to take any action on this. We have some of the most foolish drug laws, let alone cannabis driving laws, and our politics are just not ready for it. But I think Victoria is in with a shot, because it seems like there is political appetite on behalf of government and other parties to pursue this. And now the bump in the road is the bureaucracy, and in particular the police and the justice bureaucracies. But those can be overcome if there's sufficient political appetite to just make it happen.
I agree with that.
We'll have to see. Yeah,
I think as well, it's an interesting point you raised, Reese, about how one of the authors of that paper is a bureaucrat who's involved in it. I know that there were quite a few bureaucrats that gave evidence in the Victorian Parliament's recent inquiry into the use of cannabis. Mind you, Victoria, despite Mitch and I and others liking to think that we're a bit progressive, we certainly trailed New South Wales on safe injecting rooms by about 20 years. And that followed quite a myriad of various parliamentary committees in which bureaucrats gave evidence about how successful the room had been up at, I think it's King's Cross in Sydney.
King's Cross, yeah.
And there's still been backlash, although thankfully, I guess the outcome-based policy has prevailed in this instance, and we're now getting a second room that will actually go in the Melbourne CBD. So that's
where it's most needed.
So I whether or not, the sort of the real world outcome, like I remember actually in New South Wales, there was a coronial inquest into some drug deaths at festivals, and there were people, I think, from various bureaucratic positions that were giving evidence about how pill testing would be effective. And of course, then your Premier Gladys Berejiklian was very quick to sort of say, well, no, there won't be any of those being rolled out across New South Wales. So we are grappling with ideology of political leadership versus the real practical reality in areas across all different policy platforms, driving. And we heard it today with Scott Morrison, but I'm sorry, I'm ranting a little bit here. But
on the safe injecting room, you have a fair point, but keep in mind, the safe injecting centre in the Cross was originally illegal. It was originally an act of civil disobedience by people who would have been arrested and could easily have been arrested and imprisoned for providing that service to people who inject drugs. And it was only the overwhelming, obvious, immediate positive impact of that center on overdose deaths in the Cross at the time that sort of held back the government from putting their foot down. And then eventually, after a few years, they sort of went, yeah, okay, you can have one. You can have one in the whole state, but that's your lot. And that got enshrined in legislation, So that's why we've still only got one after however many decades, 20 years or whatever it is. But yeah, drug policies are tricky, right? And they come in fits and starts. So
and I think also I'm just thinking on the driving. I mean, we've had ads in Victoria from Victoria Police saying, if you drink then drive, you're a bloody idiot. But if you drive on drugs, you're out of your mind. I can't really work it out, because I think if you drive on drugs to an extent that you are impaired, I would also regard you as a bloody idiot. And equally, I would think somebody who is drunk, is out of their mind. But yeah, we have there's different ways that Victoria Police like to treat people who take any kinds of substances. And I agree with you, Reese. I think that the only way that this campaign will be won is by giving, or through the messaging of giving equal rights to all people who are taking different kinds of medicines.
Yeah, but if you drink to 0.04 blood alcohol level and then drive, you're not a bloody idiot, actually. No. So there's the argument. Yeah. And I think that's what it's about. It's about moving towards a model where we have that same kind of threshold in place for THC. Obviously, if your blood THC content exceeds, I don't know what the threshold, maybe Reese would be better equipped to say, but a certain level, there would be a cause for concern. But certainly at the lower end, where we're seeing people who have, say, a broad spectrum product that's got trace amounts of THC, they certainly don't deserve to be treated in the same manner as somebody who's got a DUI.
They're not bloody idiots, are they?
Definitely not bloody idiots.
You'd be hard pressed to say they're bloody idiots. The difference between alcohol and cannabis, or THC, is, unlike alcohol, there's no direct correlation between the concentration of THC in your blood and how impaired you are. And that's been shown, many times in recent papers. So we can't hold out hope that we will magically develop a test that tests the level of the per se limits, like, X nanograms per milliliter of THC metabolites in your blood is permitted. I don't think that's solving anything. I don't think that's what we should be working towards. Basically, we have two options. Well, few options. Maintain the status quo, reform the laws to exempt prescription medicinal cannabis patients if they're not otherwise suspected to be impaired, and to scrap the whole testing for THC at the roadside entirely, which is not likely, or and this is a longer term option, develop impairment-based tests, some kind of functional test that can be easily and accurately conducted at the roadside, which is also not an easy one to fix necessarily. So broader reforms to drug driving laws are very much a long-term thing, in my opinion. The short-term opportunity we have is for legally prescribed medicinal cannabis patients who aren't otherwise suspected of being impaired. That's really the only viable win that we can hope for, I think, in the next few years, personally.
How would you quantify impairment?
Well, so if someone is stopped because they're weaving and they do a swab test, oh, you have the presence of THC, you're done, right? But that's not how the vast majority of people get done for THC in their system while they're driving. The vast majority of people get stopped randomly at the roadside. So if you're being stopped randomly at the roadside, it's not because you're obviously driving while impaired. You've been randomly selected and you happen to have THC in your system. So if you then happen to have a medical prescription and the cops have no other reason to suspect that you're driving dangerously, they should treat it like any other prescription medicine and say, on your way, no worries. But of course, if someone's running into parked cars and the cops come up and test them and they test positive for THC, that's an offense. You shouldn't be doing that, and that's fine. You can maintain that while allowing legally prescribed patients to not be stopped randomly and prosecuted.
So what happens if you run into the back of somebody's car and they test you and you've got codeine in your system? Does that codeine in your system play into the offense?
My understanding is that, and I'm not a lawyer, if you can demonstrate that you were taking your medicine as recommended to you by a doctor and that you did not feel you were impaired at the time, then you have a very good chance of not copping a charge. I don't know if it's a perfect defense or anything like that. Yeah.
I think it comes back to that point I was making at the beginning, and I should just clarify. I didn't intend any criticism of Drive Change. I think they're doing an amazing job. It was more about how do you create the political will for change, and I think you're right, Reese. It is baby steps, and it's those kind of wins that are going to get us to the end result. Because the problem at the moment is I just can't see. Politicians are deeply cynical people who ultimately are interested in your vote first, and if there's votes in it, then they're more likely to take notice. And I just don't know if there's enough votes in this. I was interested in what you said about, if you're randomly stopped. So the 1,500 people who got randomly stopped in Nimbin or around Nimbin for Mardi Gras, how random was that? I mean, the amount of money that gets spent on this is just infuriating, really. Especially as I say, when I saw that ad campaign, I thought, that this is. This is not just indifference. This is proactively actually, going out and spending money on enforcing the law and telling people that the law's there. So I just think it's a tough gig, that one.
But on the flip side, wouldn't you expect that the tax revenue generated by cannabis would be something of an incentive to the politicians, to governments, in terms of, especially when you're considering the kinds of debts we're incurring now with all these lockdowns coming live to you straight from Melbourne here. But these types of things, you could see cannabis as a pathway to help relieve some of those financial burdens, for example.
I've never felt, sorry, I'll let you please go on this.
No.
I've never felt that argument really flies politically. And it feels to me like it's probably an issue where, generally cannabis is an issue where politicians follow, not lead. So if you look at, even countries like the US and states in the US, it's when public opinion becomes, unarguable, that's the point where you get change. I don't think, with the exception of people who don't actually have political power, politicians without political power, I just don't think I don't think that flies.
I mean, tobacco, though, for example.
Yeah, but tobacco is different, I think, because it's different for a whole number of reasons, right? Yeah. I think the excise taxes the taxes on tobacco are a huge money raiser for the government, which definitely makes it more attractive to pursue that policy to reduce smoking rates, because you get this huge cash bonus at the end of it also. But they are deliberately designing those policies in such a way as to discourage as much as they can tobacco use. So it's not as if they are expanding access to a consumer good so that they can generate more profit from it. I think it's an accidental, opportunistic benefit that means they lean more heavily on the tax lever than the other levers they might be pulling, but they also are pulling to reduce tobacco consumption rates. So the money they make from taxing tobacco can't offset the amount of money that needs to be spent on public health to deal with the health outcomes of tobacco use.
Absolutely.
But I'm kind of with Martin on this. I think although obviously legalizing cannabis for recreational use would produce significant economic benefits in a whole number of ways, including taxes, but also like real estate and employment and that kind of thing. I don't think that's the argument, or even the top sort of three arguments that we should be making about why we should legalize recreational cannabis. Because there's plenty of other things we could be doing, like not investing in building new coal-fired power stations. There's plenty of other examples where governments spend immensely more amounts of money on policies that are obviously bad for society, because of political, moral, or social reasons. And cannabis is a drug. Drug policies are especially emotionally charged. So I think we need to deal with how people think and feel about drugs,
and I think
more than convince them that it's profitable to legalize them personally.
Yeah, I think as well, cutting through, I agree with both of you. And I think, Martin, you're right. The political will needs to be there. And we're just constantly seeing that despite the fact that some 5 years ago now, since Australia first legalized medicinal cannabis, we still have, I mean, the PM's, Scott Morrison came out today and said, had a message for all recreational drug users in Australia, saying that there's nothing social about illicit drug use in this country and that it fuels organized crime and fuels human misery. I can think of other things that fuel human misery, such as offshore detention of children. But I think more to the point, I mean, that must be seen by him to be a vote winner. He's doing that as I guess, some sort of populist policy. So when you think of how remarkable it is against that backdrop that we even have a medicinal cannabis industry that has, I think, thrived and flourished in the last 5 years, it is in no part with any thanks to the incumbent federal government that we have, nor indeed any of the senior health people who I think have been constraining it. So do you ever get the sense that with a change of government, we might actually really see things accelerate in the industry?
Reese had his thinking face on, so I was waiting for the pearl of wisdom. I'll just come back to my previous point, is that, you know, and pardon the pun, I just think is how much political capital are you willing to burn through for something? And some things are just, you know, really, really important, and, you know, to governments, I mean, and to political parties, and some things they're probably at best neutral on. So, as I say, I don't think that necessarily if we had a Labour government, they would lead on this any more than the incumbents. And, you know, the Greens unfortunately aren't likely to get in anytime soon. So I'm not sure that's the answer. I think the answer is it's probably micro more than macro. I think it's having, you know, conversations, you know, individually and with groups, and sort of changing things from below, if you like. And you think about medicinal cannabis, that's how that was driven. It certainly wasn't driven from above. So I think it's probably going to be incremental, a lot of hard work and a lot of persuasion. The thing that I always come back to is if you look at New Zealand and the campaign there, again, it was close, but, you know, that campaign got so bogged down in sort of minutiae of kind of, you know, not having you know, cannabis shops near schools, and really allowed the argument or started to had the argument on the turf of the no campaign. And I think it's difficult, but I don't think you can have the argument there. You've got to talk about, you know, regulation rather than legalization. You know, this is how do you make people safe, not it's a free for all. You know, it's that sort of language I think you have to use in order to persuade people, because you know, it might be 10 or 20% of the population feel like we do, 10 or 20% of the population, you know, are absolutely dead set and anti, and the rest probably don't think about this very often unless somebody speaks to them about it. So it's how you speak to them about it at that point makes the difference. The reason why, you know, usually, you know, governments swing because people change their minds. We've got to change people's minds.
Yeah. Do you think that's? Yeah, no, you go. Sorry. You go.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I think the reason why we have legalized medical cannabis in Australia is because medical cannabis is not recreational cannabis. So, although they are closely related, obviously, like, you know, and it's hard to disentangle them a lot of the time. The reason why medical cannabis legalization was successful is because immense public support, public demand, and we're talking about sick kids. We're not talking about, you know, you and me smoking a joint after work, whatever, right? So the fact that it was framed explicitly and exclusively as a necessary medicine, it slipped underneath all of that anti-cannabis sort of ideology and emotional sort of, you know, how people feel about illicit drugs, and you know, that's been why it's we've had it in at the same time as we've had continuing sort of, prohibitionist sort of ideology and all other sort of aspects. Yeah.
But at the same point, what about the fact that this could follow a kind of American model in terms of the states legalizing first in a way, like we already see it in ACT, for example.
Well, let's not forget that, Victoria passed legislation legalizing the commercial cultivation, manufacture and supply of medicinal cannabis in violation of in the absence of federal law and in violation of international law, which is what triggered the Commonwealth to step in and pass its own legislation. So you're 100% right. This already happened with medical cannabis. Victoria was basically played chicken with the Commonwealth and won, and that's why we have a Commonwealth framework. And maybe that can happen with recreational cannabis too.
Probably Queensland, I'd say next.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, Queensland has gone from, because they introduced Queensland, for people who aren't familiar, in 2017, passed a new law about how to access medicinal cannabis. And it's over 100 pages long. And it was like really intense. It was like, rules about, pharmacists and the offenses that they could commit. It was really cumbersome, and you'd need a state approval to prescribe a Schedule 4 or a Schedule 8 medicinal cannabis product in addition to a Commonwealth approval. It was a really draconian and really sort of like over-engineered piece of legislation. And 2 years later, they repealed it. Just gone.
Yeah, because they realised that 70% of the population is probably after work up there. It would explain a lot, actually.
Yeah. But yeah, they really went from being one of the most restrictive states in terms of patient access, literally just a few years ago, to now probably definitely the most permissive, and where the vast majority of SASB approvals come from. It's crazy. Yeah,
it is crazy. I can see definitely Queensland and potentially even WA. They always have this kind of history of wanting to do their own thing, I think, over there. And I know there's a few projects getting approved over there at the moment because they want to they definitely see it as a way. I do want to steer the conversation towards another little area that I've discussed with Martin already, and yourself, Reese, and obviously with Andrew pretty much every other day, around this idea of the other parts of the cannabis that we don't talk about as much. So beyond THC, beyond CBD, the quality of cannabis, we're finding more and more people talk about the entourage effect. They talk about whole plant extract. But what do we really know in Australia about minor cannabinoids, terpenes, these types of things? And when we're considering the quality of products, and always the term, GMP comes up in any one of those discussions, it's always about, the procedural kind of the procedure that each of the pharmaceutical companies has to follow in order to be the highest quality. We talk about this idea of quality in terms of what I would say sterility, whereas there is also quality in terms of, I would argue there's also quality in terms of the compounds that exist within the cannabis, both from a genetic perspective and the way it's grown. Because, when we talk about whole plant extract, when we talk about entourage effect, it can only be as efficacious as those compounds that actually exist in the plant themselves, in the final dose medicine. I'd love to get your thoughts on the idea of sterility versus quality in terms of that full spectrum, quote unquote, that gets passed around a lot. Do you have any commentary on that, either Martin or Reese?
I have some thoughts, but Martin, do you have anything you want to get off your chest before I go on a rant? Definitely deferring to you on this one. Okay, cool. Well, look, so a few things. First of all, the entourage effect is demonstrated in terms of cannabinoids interacting with each other. There's no evidence that I'm aware of in humans that terpenes interact in a meaningfully therapeutic way in the products that are available to patients. There's some hypotheses based on preclinical evidence and other stuff that maybe that's true, but I'm not convinced necessarily. I'm skeptical, basically, is the right way to put it, I guess. And I keep an open mind, and we all should. The other thing is, some medicines need to be sterile, right? Like, depending on the patient, depending on the medicine, you would expect medicines to be sterile. So I'm not against the idea of sterility in terms of the absence of, certain levels of microbes or bacteria or whatever, because that may be necessary depending on what we're talking about.
Sure.
there's obviously a lot of, I think there's some frustration about, some of the stringent quality standards that we have in Australia about, those sorts of things. And that means that a lot of cannabis flower in particular goes through gamma radiation. And we know that that does affect, that does reduce the terpene levels in flower products, and that may affect the therapeutic outcomes of those products possibly. But these are all open questions. I don't think we know. I'm not certain enough about whether terpenes are therapeutic in that way, and I'm not certain about whether the quality standard requirements we have in Australia are too much. I'm not informed enough. I'm not a scientist, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I understand why people are concerned about that stuff, and why some people would be frustrated by it. But I think these are all like very legitimate questions that we should be trying to answer through research and evidence. That's just my sort of feelings on the matter, I guess.
Yeah, I guess assuming that and based off the opening statements that you are a cannabis enthusiast, how would you describe the experience, with different batches you might have come across over your years? The fact is that we do have, you can say, well, that was a really shit batch of weed that I got, or wow, that was the most amazing. And we differentiate it. We have High Times Cannabis Cup in America, for example, to praise the best products that are, or flowers that are out there, or whatever's available on the market. And you'd imagine that that's not just all about the high. You'd have to say that would actually have therapeutic. I would draw the conclusion that would have a therapeutic side to it beyond just the high that people are experiencing when they smoke.
It's entirely possible. I mean, look, the thing is, humans are very good at experiencing things, at causing ourselves to experience things, right? So, because as consumers of cannabis, all we get is what it looks like and what it smells like. We, of course, would naturally assume that there is a correlation between the effect of consuming a product and what it looks like and smells like. It's a perfectly reasonable assumption to draw, but it's not necessarily true that those things are causally related. They very well could be. In fact, they probably are, but we don't really know that that's the case.
Sure.
So given that is, given that supposition, before we, in my opinion, like if we're talking about, what level of microbial limits should be permitted for medicinal cannabis flower in Australia, and if the argument is it's more therapeutic if we allow products to be made in this way, which is different to the way we're currently making that product, that needs to be supported by some kind of evidence about the fact that is actually more therapeutic. And we don't have that evidence yet. And, once again, I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the correct response to that is necessarily. And I think we should be talking about it, and we should be investigating these things. But I think the jury's still out, personally.
I think there is emerging evidence to suggest that the entourage effect is definitely at play, and there's an overwhelming amount of anecdotal evidence that would suggest that that's the case. Whereas you've got people using maybe 100, 150 milligrams per mil type CBD isolate products, and then they try a broad or full spectrum product that is CBD dominant at a lower ratio that works for them better.
Oh, please don't get me wrong. No, I'm much more convinced that cannabinoids interact with each other in ways that are synergistic, right? But terpenes are volatile chemicals. If you ingest terpenes, there's no possibility of any therapeutic effect, basically, is my understanding of the science anyway. If you inhale them, maybe there's more of an opportunity for a therapeutic effect. Like, so in an oil product, for example, having a full spectrum oil extract, that makes sense to me. Multiple cannabinoids interacting synergistically, sure. I could very easily believe that produces a more therapeutic effect than an isolate. Although I've spoken with many patients and doctors who swear by the isolate product that they're using. So of course it's right.
Sure. Sure.
But if we're talking about ingesting oil, according to secondhand information that I've heard from people I trust, terpenes don't really enter into it.
So you're saying
not an expert. Yeah.
Yeah, but in terms of inhaling, that could be a distillate that you or a vape type product that could be
that makes more that seems more likely to be relevant to have terpenes. But once again, we don't know for sure if they are medically relevant.
Understandable. I think my question comes from if we're sacrificing that efficacy in that full spectrum, assuming that the terpenes do play a role as well as the minor cannabinoids. If we're sacrificing that efficacy in the pursuit of sterility only, then I think that is something that I would be not concerned about, but I see it as a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Well, the real, I mean, for me, sorry, Andrew, one quick. For me, like I'm with you, but from a different angle, maybe. Like,
sure,
producing products to a sterile level, for example, producing isolate products is much more expensive than producing a full plant extract product. So whether or not it's more therapeutic, because that's a really difficult question to answer confidently, we know it's much more expensive. So if we understand the risks of microbial levels, and if we can make a good case for, hey, actually, we don't need to have it up here, we can have it down here and no one's worse off, then yeah, I'm totally with you. Let's change that.
Yeah. And I'm not saying let's not make sterile products, because obviously if you can maintain both, that's the goal, right?
Happy days. But there's trade-offs. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And I think,
I think though, beyond the sterility trade-off as well, I feel as though the industry in Australia, which I know you guys are obviously in that position of having a bird's eye view on everything that's going on, I still feel as though, to your point, Reese, about the cannabinoid interaction that we know about, there is a focus on products that only deal with major cannabinoids. And we always talk about there's so much more research that is needed and that is already happening in the field of medicinal cannabis. But of what research is available, if you're a cannabis company, you're going to rely upon what research is out there already. And there's obviously a lot more that's been studied of THC and CBD than there has of the other minor cannabinoids. And I think that if I'm looking at a snapshot of where we're at in Australia, the industry in 2021, it really is just totally dominated by THC, CBD dominant products, or otherwise the one-to-ones. And I would love to see companies dealing with some more interesting strains pre-extraction and really giving Australian patients access to a truly full spectrum oil product that is maybe or maybe not terpene rich, but at the very least dense with lots of cannabinoids. And I think there's a real absence of those products in Australia.
Yeah, and there's nothing stopping those products coming to market either, right? Like there's no regulatory or legislative barrier preventing a company that wants to bring a full spectrum CBN dominant flower or oil product to the market. There's literally nothing formally preventing companies doing that. If they want to, they can. And I think that'll come in time, right? Like how many people in your life, I mean, that's a bad example possibly, because we're cannabis people, right? We talk about this stuff all the time, so it seems obvious to us, and it seems like things are moving slower than they should be. Most people that I speak to who aren't part of my work sort of like environment, or people who I've chewed the ear off for years about cannabis, most people haven't heard of CBD, or if they do, they don't really understand what it is. So like having a conversation about, also there's like 150 other random chemicals that may or may not be efficacious. Why don't we have those products on the market? It's like
big learning curve.
It's a big learning curve, right? And especially for doctors, they're just getting their heads around THC and CBD and ratios. Different ratios, maybe they're just being introduced to the concept of like a full spectrum versus an isolate product. It'll be a while before they're ready to have a conversation about, CBGA or other, cannabinoids that they haven't come across yet. Yeah.
And just thinking about it from a wider, just how industries evolve kind of point of view, whether it's cannabis or any other industry, what you see typically is a bunch of people who kind of, get involved early on. They're the early adopters. They go for the quick wins. They take a lot of risk, but they're looking to get a return on their investment. And then a little bit like we are now. People suddenly go, oh, you know, it's a bit of a commodity. You know, where's the innovation? And then you get the next wave of companies that come along and actually start to innovate and start to try and be different, because they can't play a volume game with the big end of town. So I think we have to always remember how young this industry actually is, and look at what happens elsewhere, and you think that will come, but it's probably a bit early, I would suggest.
It is. Well, it's probably timely to ask you guys actually about your industry observations, given that you do sit at the helm of the leading industry publications. So what are some trends? Have you got any juicy bits for Mitch and I to ponder?
Reece, do you want to take first swing at that?
Sure.
I should
say there's I'd like to think that there's not much that that Mitch and I miss, but the reality is there's probably plenty. So I just thought we'd get a scoop.
Yeah. Well, we've recently gotten access to a more detailed than usual data set about SASB approvals in Australia that has allowed us to generate some really interesting insights about recent trends in who's getting access to what products. So we'll be sort of rolling that content out over the next few weeks, and it'll be interesting to see sort of people's responses to it. I don't mean to be too cagey, but I haven't even written a story that's meant to tease the content that we haven't released yet. So sorry about that.
No.
But so all I can say is, the demographics of patient access in Australia are changing significantly and rapidly. And we need to start paying attention to that, and that'll be explained in a few weeks' time when we release the data. But there's so much going on, like there's any day now we're expecting the government report on import quality standards and compounding. We've got the driving law reform stuff that's sort of boiling away in Victoria and around the country. We've got the Greens introducing Senate legislation in New South Wales about recreational legalization. There's never a dull moment. But I think, sorry, go on.
I was just thinking as well, I think one story that really shook things up recently was the CDA Express. I heard a myriad of different views, and I'm not trying to court controversy in raising it, but I just, it was interesting seeing that, on the one hand, patient access improved. I see the argument, but then on the other hand, was the level of diligence by the doctors adequate? And I know that resulted in a tension between that company and the industry association, from which they're now, I think, not a member. But yeah, it really just every month on month, there is never a dull moment. So
never a dull moment.
Well, it's funny you say that. Actually, the point I was going to make was, number one, we're not short of stories ever, and number two, that I think as an industry, it's probably a bit fragmented from a kind of PR and lobbying perspective, and I think, I keep coming back to, the down scheduling of CBD and the way that some companies use that as an opportunity to probably pump their share price, whereas others were trying to say, well, no, hold on a second, let's explain the nuances of TGA registration and ARTG and when this actually going to happen, and we're trying to sort of hold back the tide. And I think at some point the industry sort of perhaps needs to kind of have a serious conversation with itself about how it wants to represent itself to the public and to politicians and to the media, because it feels a little bit fragmented. It feels like not everybody, but people are trying for their own company advantage. And that's probably not helping some of those kind of conversations around, professionalism and
it doesn't feel patient first when you read some flimsy ASX announcement that says something like, company A has begun discussions with company B about a proposed in principle offtake agreement, where there's absolutely no substance, legally or otherwise, to that announcement. And it's I think it does generate, I mean, there's an argument to say, well, companies in all sectors that publicly listed are engaging in that kind of puffery, but it's I don't know. I always just roll my eyes when I read that sort of stuff.
To my mind, the least patient-focused thing I've seen since I've been writing about the industry is Greg Hunt turning up at medicinal cannabis conferences as the health minister talking about the export market. That sums it up to me. He's the health minister and he's talking about exports. Yeah. He's not talking about the people ultimately who he's responsible for. His department is responsible for looking after. So I think that's where the industry could do a better job of speaking with one voice. And I'm not saying that that's not a criticism of the trade associations or anybody else. It's just acknowledging the fact that it's a young industry. Everyone's trying to get ahead, and sometimes they're kind of clambering over other people to do it.
I've never thought about it that way before, Martin. You're 100% spot on. Why is the health minister mostly talking about export markets for a pharmaceutical sector when he should be talking about Australians and their access to medicine? That is quite strange. Well, I think that's a symptom of the industry, right? Like, we've been very demand-led. We've been very supply-led. Like government investment in supporting companies build fixed infrastructure, talking about jobs, talking about square meter under canopy, build it and they will come kind of attitude. And that's failed because we've not been focusing, governments have not been focusing on where the demand's going to come from for these huge greenhouses that are meant to bring in all this squillions of dollars of revenue for government coffers, right? And we need to address that problem fundamentally, because there's no export markets, really. Australia is the third largest export market in the world, and we're talking about exporting. So, anyway.
Sorry, I was just going to say the other thing is that Reese has just said I'm 100% right. So I'm going to take that and I'm not saying anything else. That's me. I'm done.
Well, that's one out. There's 3 to go.
Oh, dear. I was just thinking that, the emerging area of, because we do like to address other alternative medicines on this podcast other than cannabis, but maybe that's the breakthrough that psilocybin needs. If you can just get in a room with Greg Hunt and explain to him that you want to build this big facility and it's purely for exporting magic mushrooms overseas, then maybe that's the way to do it. Anyway,
take notes. But not to bag on psychedelic assisted psychotherapy at all, but it's a very different economic proposition, right? Because you could grow the world's supply of psilocybin in a single greenhouse that cultivates enough cannabis to supply Australia with cannabis.
Yeah.
And, when we're talking about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, we're talking about minuscule doses in terms of volume, that are of a drug that is, in terms of the therapy, designed to not be taken chronically, right? Like, it's a few interventions and then you have an improvement and you go away and you live your life, But cannabis is like, a medicine that you take all the time, so the economic opportunity for that is like very different.
It's limited. And of course, all the infrastructure, in the personnel required for that type of clinical, but no. So, okay. So we know about then that there's some juicy data that will be coming out, which tells us about changes in the trends of, does it tell us about, I think you might have touched on this, but maybe the different types of products that we're seeing people move towards. I did see that flower continues to surge as a preferred cannabis product over oil. Is that
it's that Queensland. It's that Queensland push.
It's all part of the milieu,
I will just say, and I don't want to embarrass you, Reese, but Reese was so excited about this data that he actually sent me a Slack message on a Saturday afternoon and said, "Let me show you. Can I talk you through this data?" And we went through it, and he was still in his dressing gown at 3:00 in the afternoon. He was so excited he hadn't even got dressed.
It is exciting. Well, not getting dressed is commonplace here in Melbourne during this lockdown. But in saying that, I'm kind of curious. Where is this data? Is this
obtained under FOI from the TGA, or is this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That's the only way to get SASB data. But the trick isn't in getting SASB data. The trick is in coding it and
Pivot table.
laboriously, God, spending literally a day or two working with Excel sheets that are so big you can't open them in Excel and solving that problem. So good luck.
So what do you use?
Yeah, well, good question. That's a trade secret.
Awesome. Well, I'm eagerly awaiting your analyses on those, but I'm definitely going to go look at that little portal a bit later.
Yeah, definitely. No, have a quick go for your life. You're more than welcome. Yeah,
thank you. I guess we're kind of coming towards the end, but I do know there was one little topic that Martin, I think, also expressed he might be interested in chatting about, and we are more than happy to chat about it. We love chatting about maybe the opioid crisis, cannabis, that crossover space where we've had actually people coming out recently on Twitter. I know, Andrew, you had a little bit of a to and fro with one specific anaesthetist coming out and talking about the difference, or maybe cannabis not being effective at all.
Which is very silly. You should never get on the bad side of an anaesthetist, especially not one who's wheeling you into to an operating theatre. But no, this is somebody who is the head of the ANZ College of Anaesthetists. And we just actually had a very rigorous exchange of ideas on Twitter. And it was in relation to a piece that Professor Vag, is his name, had written in The Guardian about how his organization was not recommending that its members prescribe cannabis as a medicine for treating pain. And obviously there is just an enormous amount of anecdotal evidence which suggests that it can provide significant relief for some people. So I found that piece interesting. I think I recall a tweet or two from you, Reese. I'm not sure. Did you get involved in my my thread with Professor Vag?
I mean, I've engaged with Professor Vag on Twitter before. I'm not sure we were part of the same thread, but yeah, I mean, like, you know, I have perversely, and I don't usually have sympathy for people who I disagree with, but I kind of have a bit of sympathy for Vag, and I'll tell you why. Because like the best evidence that we have about treating long-term chronic pain recommends that people should be treated holistically. It's treated in terms of their biological requirements, their psychological requirements, and their social requirements. And the evidence suggests that treating those things holistically achieves the best outcome for patients. And the way that that's best coordinated is through specialist pain management clinics, and where people can come in and be seen by a team of doctors who understand these things, and and that tends to produce the best outcomes for people on average over time. So I get, like, Dr. Vag, like, saying, hey, let's not pay attention to cannabis because we know what the evidence is in. Well, the current evidence we have shows that this treatment is actually working for people, and that's not funded well enough at the moment. So I can understand the sort of defensiveness of people when they know that they've got their mindset on this is the solution to people's chronic pain problems. And there's so much noise. You can imagine, right, working in pain management as a doctor, the number of times a day you would hear the word cannabis. It would drive you up the wall if you weren't already into cannabis and you had your mindset on what you currently understand is the best treatment for chronic pain. And you would, I can imagine feeling very frustrated by all of this. You spent all this time and energy trying to get governments to focus on pain clinics, and then suddenly, everyone's getting pulled to this one side about cannabis. It doesn't necessarily mean he's correct, and I disagree with Dr. Vag on several points. But you can cut, I agree.
I think it's sort of.
I don't. Actually, don't.
Fair enough.
Well, I mean, the one thing I will say is that despite the effectiveness of opioids, I mean, and you touched on it, Mitch, there's a reason why opioid has become such a dirty word. I mean, just the sheer number of adverse events, fatalities. I mean, I've spoken about it on this podcast, but being prescribed endone following some surgery I had earlier this year, was just horrible. And I could not be more excited to be sort of weaning off it over the course of a week post-surgery. So I do, yes, I have sympathy for all those reasons, but I just cannot understand why pain medicine specialists wouldn't at least be open-minded to something else which doesn't create dependency, constipation, in some cases, shallow breathing when people are taking, those respiratory effects that it can have in chronic use. So it was an interesting piece, but
I just don't get why, as you said, Reese, if you're sitting there and you're prescribing opiates or whatever, you're in the pain clinic, you're prescribing, and then people are saying, cannabis, and why that would make you upset. For me, I would say, it would spark my interest. I would want to, sure. And I know he says his argument is that the research isn't out there, but clearly we now have a couple of products that have been approved, Epidiolex, Sativex, for example, that there is evidence to suggest that this product works, albeit that they weren't for pain. It's not
a fantasy.
Yeah, it's not a fantasy. It's not snake oil.
So I get where you're coming from. I guess I'm not, once again, I'm not a clinician. I don't know how these things work, right? But no one should be prescribing, and no doctor is recommended by the Australian government to prescribe opioids to manage long-term chronic non-cancer pain. It's not indicated. And I don't think it's a binary choice between wanting to prescribe opiates and wanting to prescribe cannabis. I suspect, and I don't know this for sure, but I suspect the pain management field is trying to move away from prescription medicines in general, because no prescription medicines have really been any good for managing chronic pain for all of human history. And what is more effective seems to be, cognitive behavioral therapy, counseling, social integration, physiotherapy, those other kinds of therapies. So personally though, if I was in that scenario and you had a prescription medicine that had a very good risk profile like cannabis does, that has very few side effects like cannabis does, that may work for chronic pain, you would give it a go. I would give it a go. But, of course I would say that because I'm a cannabis person, not a
I was just going to say, I think I'd make 2 points here, and it comes back to that thing about, the industry's full of passionate people who, see what good this can do for patients and society and the economy and everything else. Most people don't think like that. Most doctors don't really care, and you've got a bunch of clinicians who are clearly of kind of, they get it and they'll be really supportive, but most are very busy and probably borderline disinterested, to be honest. So I think I kind of he's annoying and he's obviously got a voice, but I still think most people are probably ambivalent. Most GPs are probably ambivalent. Yeah. The other point I'd make is just interesting that there's some more data that we're going to publish tomorrow or Thursday that will be in the newsletter actually, around evidence of opioid use declining as medicinal cannabis increases. So there was some stuff from Ameria and MedLab Clinical a few weeks ago. There's more coming, so I think that's gonna help, as we've talked about. It all comes down to research and evidence in the end, and there's more of that we're going to publish.
Now that's a feel good story. I look forward to reading that, and I imagine there'll be some interesting data about the pain indications specifically in that bigger data piece that Reese has got up his sleeve, which we eagerly await. Did you have any more questions, Mitch? I'm mindful we've taken more than an hour, Martin and Reese's time.
I'm getting panicked messages from my son because he's invited us for dinner, which is a rare enough occurrence in itself.
Yeah, well, we will let you get that, Martin.
I'm really gonna have to go and eat it.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. We're just trying to wrap you into our world where nobody's allowed to leave home at all, and everyone has to use it. So
exactly, it's the Victorian way. No, thank you both so much for your time, for your insights. We just love chatting with both of you. So really cannot thank you enough for joining us for the podcast. And I'm sure at some point, Mitch and I are going to try and steal you back on for another episode.
Or jump on yours.
Yeah, well, both sound good.
In the cannabis,
thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Right. And must remind everyone to obviously follow and subscribe. We have to do that for Altmed, but also definitely on Cannabis. They've got some incredible content, some unique content. Definitely get on there as what is it? The the premium subscription.
Oh yes, a premium membership. That's what you want.
Beautiful. And of course, to follow Reece Cohen on Twitter. Is that what we want?
Yep, at Reece Cohen.
At Reece Cohen.
There's no other Reece Cohen.
That's probably my two main news sources outside our own would be Cannabis and Reece Cohen's Twitter. So definitely get amongst that if you're interested in the space within Australia and beyond. So
enjoy dinner, Martin, and we'll
thank you very much.
Until next time, we'll take care, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye.
See ya.